Welcome back, everyone, for part two, LockBit, Techniques, Tactics, and Procedures with Scott Schifferman and Aaron Goldstein. Could you give some color to that and describe how they are organized to the extent that you know and how they operate on the inside?
Well, so I haven't been able to spend as nearly as much time on them as I have done on Conti and other major groups in the past. I will say that one way you can understand how adept and powerful a group is not just based on their numbers, but rather their victimology. And if you look at the fact that they hit Accenture and held them to a $50 million ransom, and that was an elongated, like Aaron was saying, it was a very long negotiation, painful process, and Accenture being also a top echelon cybersecurity services organization as well. It's a pretty hard target on a number of levels. I mean, they, in their own right, they have one of the best and largest IR response teams in the world, right? Globally, right? You can have an event anywhere in the world, and you can find an Accenture person that will be on site quickly to address that. So they understand this space as well as any other organization. If you look at the largest bank in the world, ICBC, right? Like the Chinese largest bank, literally in the world. And we know financial targets are some of the hardest, best positioned, best resourced, best staffed 24/7 operations in the world. And they got in successfully and with great with great power and with great leverage, right? So you can get into an organization with the spearfish any day of the week, but can you carry that process through? Do you have the infrastructure, the support, the skilled negotiating, the handoffs, all the stuff Aaron was speaking of, to actually manifest that into a successful ransom? And also, you have to be powerful enough to believe that the risk of hitting a major organization like that, putting you on the number one target list for all global international law enforcement and intelligence organizations and governments and Department of Justice around the world, you have to believe that that taking that risk is worth the reward you're getting, and that you can survive that risk, right? And it's easy to kind of zoom out and look at this and say, we have a really big problem with a really powerful organization that's very adaptable, that can handle the biggest targets there are in the world, quite frankly. So, as to how they're structured, other than how they're functionally structured, is very similar to other large organizations of the past, like Conti Group, where you have different functions and development and research and negotiation and the financial side of the money side of it, the money laundering side, the money washing and mixing side, if you will. You have all of that in place, absolutely with LockBit. But in terms of like nuance and who's who and attribution, I haven't done as much research on them as I have in the past on other groups.
Yeah, and to add to that a little bit, I same thing. I don't have any inside scoop on the deep details of their operation. I'm not involved with it, but looking at the history of these types of groups, like Scott was saying, to be able to take on these industry titans and not be scared of the backlash. You look at like Black Matter and Dark Side ransomware groups. They got the wrong, they infected the pipeline, and they infected some other very high profile targets, and they got too much heat on them, and they ended up having to back away. Now, my personal theory is a lot of these groups actually just rebrand and start something fresh and go over again. But it shows that they're not scared of taking on these big companies, and asking for exorbitant millions of dollars in ransom. The other thing I think is kind of interesting there is that when they are dealing with these types of things, if you watch any of like the Interpol videos of shutting down like Ragnar Locker or some of these other groups, you can see that it is organized. They break into what's the equivalent of a small bunker, out in the middle of nowhere, and it's dilapidated and old computers and things like that. But then they go into a bedroom, and it's like a mattress with stacks of gold bars and dozens of like BMW keys on keychains, and just significant, ridiculous amounts of money. They do attract attention. They do get a significant payout, and that money has to go somewhere. And organized crime is probably the only way that they're going to be suited to be able to actually handle the management of that. And like Scott said, cleaning the money and converting it from the crypto into something that they can actually use, and pay out their affiliates with. I find it to be fascinating.
I'll just add on to that really quick too. Is I think it was Rapid7 that found that they were also attacking the Cisco ASA devices and VPN devices, and in that case with Cisco, after the events happened, 2 weeks later the CVE comes out for the vuln that they exploited. And the only reason I bring that up is because when you have a group that's successfully pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars of ransom, that money buys you a lot. It buys you a lot in all of the areas Aaron just went over, but one in particular that is really, really profoundly important for us to realize is that they have the ability to buy the most expensive exploits from the darknet, from researchers that there are, and that is always going to give them this multi-week, month, sometimes much longer. In case of where we work in the firmware space, that can give you a 3 or 4 year long tail before these campaigns and vulnerabilities and exploits are discovered. And that puts them ahead of just the patch problem, right? So like if a CVE is out there that's getting hit, like statistically today, when there is a patch for it, then your obligation as a victim is to patch ASAP. That's always your obligation. That's the story of the last 30 years of cybersecurity. But now that we've gone kind of full circle in 2023, and the edge devices, the network-based edge device attacks and exploits are not only back in vogue, but are really kind of the meta, if you will, of how organizations are getting taken down so severely when they are versus just a spearfish, right? That is fundamentally changing the shift of power to the attacker, because as they accumulate the ransom, they buy the next exploit that is ahead of even the patch curve. So even a perfectly run or operation is beholden to these vulnerabilities in the digital supply chain for which they have no control or visibility or understanding of, let alone when they're being exploited in a 0-day context. So it's this is why we see 1,000 incidents from one group in a year, and they aren't just arbitrary small incidents. These are hundreds of them, are very massive organizations that are well resourced.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. That's kind of like while you guys were talking, I was thinking, and interesting question come to my mind, as people would say, inquiring minds would like to know. So, with all those cases that you describe, and Scott, I think you pointed out quite interesting, and the same thing, Aaron, when they buy the money that they have. I wish I had all those, case on my keychain, but I don't. Right. So, from perspective of money can buy, and how do you guys see endpoint protection? We have a lot of things right now, and that's number one primary defense for every organization that everyone relies on. In case of Accenture, Boeing, and ICBC Bank, I'm pretty sure they had all this malware and protection loaded on their devices, and they were not sitting there. It's like, oh, I wish I had CrowdStrike, or I wish I had Silence or something else that would have prevented. So it kind of begs the question: is like, how is all those things that supposed to protect organizations, all those even exploits allowed to happen? When LockBit gets in, like, would one of these, buzzwords, endpoint protection with AI, ML, and all other things attached to it, should be able to say, it's like, hey, check this out. There's a bad guy just got in. I'm going to nab them and block it and not let them do. But yet we see all this exposure, all of a sudden data left, and you have a bunch of, I'm pretty sure all these organizations, like when you talk to financial organization, they have their insider threat protection programs in place. They have pretty much loaded endpoints with all kind of DLPs that they're supposed to prevent all this data leakage, and they minimizing risk to the extent possible. And yet, all those organizations all of a sudden gets exposed. And so I'm looking here. It's like, well, what are those protections are worse, and how is it possible to get them bypassed to the extent that they've been bypassed?
I'll give you a controversial take, and I'll let Aaron course correct me afterwards, which he's done ever since I've known him. So I'm going to say the short answer is no, meaning even the best organizations are still ill-equipped to truly be able to handle, certainly prevent, but even have eyes on and awareness, visibility into certain TTPs in particular that that the bad guys are using that we're losing against, right? And one of those is what we just discussed. You have an edge device, you have no control over that source code, but that software is from a supply chain of 25, 30 vendors upstream of it, and there's vulnerabilities in code that's 12 years old at least in that software. And so the vendor space absolutely must, and that has to be government driven with enforcements and with audits and inspections. That vendor space for those devices needs to fundamentally change what its priorities are and what it perceives as costs and impacts in legal cases against it and brand reputation, when they fail to ship securely designed, securely configured boxes. And I'm going to only escalate from there if I don't stop that point. I'll turn that off. I'm very passionate about that point. But even after the fact, right, they're in, and Aaron alluded to this, one of the things that LockBit and Conti and everybody else does really well today is once they have a point of presence internally, the first thing they're doing is enumerating that network. It's back to 1997 hacking. You're going to find all the devices and all the respective vulns, and you're going to find persistence on everything from IoT to routers to Hikvision cameras, right? And you look at the cyber Avengers, they're really good at hitting OT systems and persisting and doing C2 and data exfiltration over Hikvision cameras, right? And so most organizations will never have enough cybersecurity professionals to ever match that level of needed visibility to truly understand the TTPs that are going on. Because when you get a router or a wireless device or any kind of device that's not in your kind of Windows EDR stack world, what happens is now you can exfiltrate in ways that your DLP just does not see. You're using the device's innate functionality, built-in features on, let's say, a Microtech router to tunnel and encrypt data and send it via channels that the DLP and your firewalls and your QS services aren't monitoring for. And that's how you see organizations that have massive amounts of critical data exfiltrated, even though they have the most robust DLP, right? Same thing with backups. You have organizations that have robust backup systems, right? And they're even good at storing keys offline. But you can get into data centers and destroy the whole data center backplane via BMC management network and the backup instances too, right? Because you're operating at, let's say, a firmware level or an out-of-band management network that doesn't enjoy the same level of, ironically, security stack that's tied into your enterprise stack that's not out-of-band management. And so you have these asymmetric but very powerful ways that your TTPs allow you to effectively bypass and outpace, is maybe even a better word, an organization's ability, especially at the human level, to see and counteract these TTPs. I think we've completely lost this fight, and I don't think it's all the security industries to blame. I do believe it's governments to blame, and the entire macro incentivization process is so convoluted. And you look at the digital supply chain, it's a race to the bottom. It's feature velocity. It's low margins. It's all the things in a competitive space that produce a very, very insecure product, not one that is, oh, too bad we had a bug we didn't see. No, those companies aren't even doing normal static or dynamic application testing. They're relying on bug bounty programs to show them their vulnerabilities, offsetting that cost to industry and researchers rather than taking ownership of it and actually building it out. And until those kind of things fundamentally change, the attacker is going to have an infinity and definite and powerful advantage.
Excellent. Aaron, what's your take? Why are we still failing?
Scott makes it seem a little grim, but I do think we have a leg up. We are up against adversaries that have seemingly unlimited resources, and he's absolutely right. For the most motivated threat actors that are targeting the Fortune 10s, the Fortune 1s, or Fortune 5s rather, the big organizations, those threat actors might be leveraging those firmware attacks. They might be doing a lot of that type of stuff. My exposure and what I deal with, a lot more regularly is a little smaller scale than that. So typically, I'd say small, medium business, smaller enterprise, not the huge ones. And I get on with customers all the time, or prospects, and they say, okay, well, can your solution stop ransomware? The ransomware encryption. And I tell them, if they get to the point where there's no alerts or no activity, and encryption is the first thing you see, you've got a much bigger problem in the first place, because landing on the system, that phishing, the or the attachments, or the malware that's being added, the lateral movement, the credential dumping, the disabling of tools, all of these things should be setting off alerts and alarm bells. And the reality is, it's not just the endpoint itself. So EDR is going to get you a lot further than traditional antivirus would 5 years ago or so. It's going to help, and it's going to make it harder for the threat actors. But what Scott's saying is exactly right. Is there are a lot of other ways that you can, bypass the tools that are there. You can compromise users, and if you're not looking at their Office 365 activity, if you're not looking at those firewalls and the traffic going to them, and the management of them, if you're not looking at a holistic view of everything that's happening in the network, those blind spots are really going to cause those problems. So yeah, I always say, make sure that whatever you're using for security can encompass all the different, capabilities and third-party applications, and beyond just the endpoint, the network activity at the user level, stuff like that. Otherwise, it is going to be an uphill battle. And while a small dentist office or gas station chain is probably not going to see that 0-day Hikvision attack. Your very large silicon chip manufacturers and biotechs very well might. And depending on what you're protecting, it should delineate how much money you're spending to protect it, right? The idea is you don't want to spend more to protect it than the value of it is. So those big companies that have the budget and tooling should absolutely be doing a more holistic view. And the ones that are smaller should apply the budget they have to implement security controls that are going to give them the most bang for their buck.
I'm just
Yeah,
going to rebut really quick, Nikolay, and say I'm going to look at the scoreboard and I'm going to say we're losing the football game. Even though we win a ton of first downs, we win some games. We have good players, but at the end of the day, I've always said this. In fact, both of you know I've always said this, that it's not always a battle of technology or visibility or sophistication, quote unquote. More often than not, it's a battle of time. It's a race. And I think that where we fall down is that in our minds, we say, I have coverage here, visibility there. I should see this. And in fact, you may and you will. But do you see it fast enough to take an action that matters in terms of getting ahead of the impact of an attack, whether it's ransomware or otherwise? And I feel like shortening that time, even with the existing tools and people we have, is should be a primary objective. But very few organizations measure their success and whether they're getting better or not with security in a time-based metric. They measure it with observable quantitative data, but they don't measure it how fast we're making decisions that matter. And that's an art. And the other thing here is that we have a fundamental lack of security professionals to accommodate the demand, to actually meet the threat. Because I've seen organizations with literally the most insane cybersecurity technology stacks make fundamental, super basic flaws, errors, or have gaps that they just didn't see despite all of their diligence. And despite having a profound risk register, being driven by risk management, saying we have to address, like, we have a human problem for sure. Our technology is getting better, and we have folks like Aaron with the ability to manage that for their customers. But is that nexus enough to scale to meet the overall threat landscape? And I don't believe we're there yet, and I don't think we will be there until we offset some of these power structure problems that give the attacker these indefinite advantages, especially when it comes to vulnerabilities and insecure devices being shipped out.
Excellent. So you guys describe kind of like people are drowning and you describe in the water. So that's not a good way to end the show. So let's figure it out how to bring a little bit hope back to the table and what people need to look for and how can they defend themselves and broaden their horizon, because again, sooner or later somebody else is going to hit. And if you have something in mind that you would like to share with the audience before we part, and raise their hopes and say, hey, the world is not ending and we still can do a good job and what they need to do. So let's start with Aaron.
Yeah. So definitely the world isn't ending. I hope. There is a lot that we can do to prepare and prevent these types of things. So the technology side, I think it's well represented. EDR, understanding what's happening at the network and user level, third party tools. But what I would say is most effective, especially for ransomware or other types of critical incidents, is just preparation. Making sure that you have an incident response plan, making sure that it's actually been reviewed and it's not just collecting dust, and then putting it to the test, even if it's a basic, what we call a tabletop exercise, even just walking through with a small group of managerial and technical folks from your organization and say, okay, let's walk through what would happen if ransomware dropped on this system, or if we accidentally exposed AWS keys on GitHub, or XYZ, any number of types of incidents you want to think about. You can try and just do a tabletop, and I guarantee you will find at least one or two things that you can do to improve the next time you do one. So I'm not saying you have to do one every week or anything like that, but if you do a couple a year, you're really going to be able to improve. You can update that IR plan and get ready for the next one. And what's going to happen is if you end up having a real incident and you've done this, you're already going to be on a fast track to knowing what the next steps are, who to contact, and what your company's response is going to be. So I say practice makes perfect, and it's probably one of the best ways that we can do to make sure that if there is an incident, in that critical amount of time you have, making sure response is the number one goal.
Excellent. Scott,
Well,
raise the hope.
yeah, no, there's tremendous amount of hope, but there's also a call to action, right? And it is very much in line with what Aaron just said. But you, I think most organizations, especially large ones, like rethink everything. Like take a huge step back and start with another threat model, the one you did 10 years ago, the last time you did one, and really look at what your business is today, what your traditional supply chain is in terms of third party risk management, and then factor in the things we were talking about at the front end of this, which was, there are so many ways that these actors find ways to get leverage on you and to mess with you in negotiations and to disrupt your IR process with legal and governmental and third party and your customer base as levers they turn to continue that leverage they have with you. So if your IR plan is too technical based, like it used to be, like traditionally it has been, where your playbook is very concise in terms of technology stack and who the players are and who to call, and that's important for IR, and that needs to be refreshed all the time. But what I think a lot of organizations fail is they wait until the fog of war, when they're hit, to realize they have to make really hard decisions about what they should do in the best interest of their shareholders and third parties and themselves. And if they make those decisions ahead of time and they define the thresholds at which they're willing to make decision A or B, right? Like, what is our threshold? What is our understanding of what material impact is? What is our propensity for actually catastrophic impact with certain actor groups that might likely target my vertical, my industry? Understanding like your risk before this allows the senior leadership teams to know where those thresholds are, and that has to inform your playbooks as well, like your actual formal DFIR processes, because there's so much more nuance. There's so many more dials the attackers turn. There's so many more types of information that they're exfiltrating to hold against you and threaten to leak or sell. And Aaron said it earlier, but I'll reiterate it for people. After you've had a ransomware incident, you have to forget about the fact you had a ransomware incident, and you have to reframe the whole thing as, I've had a fundamental loss of security control for the most critical primary assets and identity management and authorization systems that I have for my entire business. And if I do not rebuild those, even in the primary sense from a security control perspective, you're going to get hit again. You're going to have the same actor come again, or you're going to have that access resold from an initial vector in that you weren't aware of because your time wrinkle didn't extend far back enough in your hot wash. You have to just be willing to say, I literally got fully compromised in, I would say, the vast majority of impactful ransomware events today by groups like this, like LockBit, right? This is a massive security incident that has to be treated as such and prepared for prior.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming on. It's definitely been enlightening and entertaining to have this discussion. And yes, threat actors always keeping us on our toes. And I truly appreciate all your insights that you shared about LockBit and your AR experience. And I'm looking forward to other conversation that we're going to have together again. So on that happy note, I'm going to end this show. And if you have anything else to share with the audience, feel free before I say goodbye.
Well, I'll just share that why it might sound with my intonation and my passion that I'm saying the sky is falling. I've shifted my tact in the last 5 years to doing just that, because any leader that's listening to this, I want to be the one person that, and I'll take the fall if the sky doesn't fall. But I'm truly believe that we've pacified ourselves in being afraid to tell it like it is and tell it as bad as it is, so that leaders are armed with enough knowledge to go to the board, to get more money, to do more things, to do better, right? And if we come at it too soft, which I think I've done in my career, the majority of my career, and I'm afraid to lean in and tell it like it is, we do an injustice at this point in time, at this inflection point, because we have a race to quantum, we have a race to AI, we have a chip war happening, we have IT sanctions going around the world. All this stuff is creating a crucible for cybersecurity to be central to all of it. Cybersecurity to not just be a ad hoc advantage, but a key primary strategic initiative for whether it's a ransomware actor or a nation state. So double down on everything you say when you mean it and you know what you're talking about, and lean in. And that's my call to arms to anybody listening.
Thank you for that, Aaron. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I like the call for arms. Scott's always thinking big picture and, always advocating for, making sure that security has a seat at any table when it comes to, the business, implementation or problems that we're solving with it. So, I completely agree in that regard. And, I just like to say, for those that are, trying to put up a good fight against these types of things, just understand that, you're not alone. There's an incredible community of people out there sharing intelligence, at a big picture. Yeah, governments, we might have some problems with intel sharing and stuff like that. But, the industry here for incident response and forensics is incredibly powerful. So share your story, share your IOCs, get with those intel groups, and together we can definitely do better than anyone doing it alone.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for your parting thoughts, and pleasure having you, Scott and Aaron, and appreciate you coming on. And with that said, that's all about, just like Aaron said, sharing is caring, and that's what we do, sharing our knowledge and for you guys to consume, and come back to our shows once we have something else to share. Right, stay tuned, and thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.